London, 1893. They called it the Winter of Whispers. Clara Thorne was a woman with nothing left, no money, no reputation, and nowhere to turn but the icy waters of the Thames. But fate has a strange way of intervening. Just as she stepped toward the edge, a carriage bearing a royal crest stopped. A prince stepped out. He offered her a life of unimaginable luxury, pearls, silks, and the title of a princess. All she had to do was pretend to be his wife for Christmas. It sounded like a fairy tale. But fairy tales have monsters, and the condition Prince Brian demanded wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence. The fog in London tasted of coal and despair. It was December 23rd, 1893, and the city was preparing for Christmas with roast goose and mulled wine. But for Clara Thorne, the holiday promised only silence. Clara pulled her threadbare shawl tighter against her shoulders. The wind off the Thames bit through the wool, stinging her skin like needles. At 22, Clara had once been the promising daughter of a Cambridge scholar. Now she was a disgraced governess, dismissed from the Kensington household of Lord Harrow, due to a diamond brooch that had gone missing, a brooch she hadn't touched. But the maid who framed her had a sweeter smile and a looser corset. She stood on Blackfriars Bridge, looking down at the churning black water. It looked peaceful compared to the gnawing hunger in her stomach. "I wouldn't recommend it, miss. The water is freezing. You'd regret the jump halfway down." The voice was deep-cultured and carried an authority that cut through the wind. Clara froze her hands, gripping the iron railing. She turned slowly. Emerging from the swirling yellow fog was a man who looked entirely out of place in the grim squalor of the docks. He was tall, wearing a heavy charcoal overcoat with a fur collar that likely cost more than Clara had earned in her entire life. Beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes were a startling, piercing blue. Intelligent, weary, and desperate. "I was merely looking at the view," Sir Clara lied, her voice trembling, not from the cold, but from shame. "In this fog." The stranger stepped closer. He didn't look predatory. He looked like a man analyzing a chessboard. He took a silver cigarette case from his pocket. "You are Clara Thorne, daughter of the late Professor Arthur Thorne. You speak French-German and a little Italian. You play the piano, though your technique is better suited to Chopin than Beethoven, and you are currently starving." Clara backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who are you?" "Are you with the police?" "I am someone in desperate need of a liar," the man said. He snapped the case shut without taking a cigarette. "My name is Brian Alexander Valois, Crown Prince of Avalonia." Clara blinked. Avalonia was a small but wealthy principality nestled in the Alps bordering Austria. It was famous for its silver mines and its ruthlessly traditional monarchy. "You're mocking me," she whispered. "I assure you, I am not." "My carriage is waiting." He gestured to a sleek black brougham waiting in the shadows, the horses stamping their hooves impatiently. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Thorne, one that will solve your poverty and my predicament." Clara looked at the dark water, then at the prince. "What kind of proposition?" "I need a wife," Brian said, his voice dropping to a hush as a group of dock workers passed by. "But only for 2 weeks, until the feast of the Epiphany. My father, King Leopold, is dying. His final wish is to see me wed before he passes. If I return home alone, the throne passes to my uncle, a man who would burn our country to the ground for a profit." "So you want to hire an actress?" Clara asked, bewildered. I need someone with breeding who has fallen on hard times, someone who understands the aristocracy, but possesses the hunger to survive it. He took a step closer, the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloping her. I will pay you £5,000, Clara. Enough to move to America. Enough to start over. £5,000. It was a fortune. It was freedom. And if I refuse? Then you return to looking at the water, Brian said brutally. But I think you want to live. Clara looked at his gloved hand extended toward her. It was a lifeline. But looking into his eyes, she saw a turbulence that frightened her. He wasn't just asking for help. He was plotting something. I'll do it, she breathed. Brian didn't smile. He nodded sharp and efficient. Good. Get in the carriage. We leave for Dover tonight. But know this, Clara Thorne, once we cross the channel you are no longer yourself. You are the Archduchess Elena of Romania. And if you falter even for a second, we both lose our heads. Clara froze as he opened the carriage door. Archduchess. But she disappeared 3 years ago. Exactly. Brian said, his face shadowed. And tonight she returns. The private cabin on the train, racing toward Vienna, was an exercise in opulence. Velvet curtains blocked out the snowy landscape, and a crystal decanter of brandy sat on a mahogany table. Yet the atmosphere inside was suffocating. Clara sat on the edge of the plush seat, wearing a gown of emerald silk that Brian's valet had produced from a trunk. It fit perfectly, disturbingly so. Brian sat opposite her, watching her with that same calculating gaze. He had been silent for hours ever since they boarded the ferry at Dover. You're staring, Clara said, her voice stronger now that she was warm and fed, though the anxiety churned in her gut. I am memorizing, Brian corrected. He leaned forward. Eleanor had a scar on her left wrist from a riding accident. You will wear a bracelet to cover yours. She was allergic to strawberries. You must refuse them. She hated the color yellow. You must sneer at it. Clara rubbed her wrist. Prince Brian, you are asking me to impersonate a woman who is likely dead. Her family, your father, they will know. They will see I am not her. My father is half blind from cataracts and haze from morphine, Brian said dismissively. He hasn't seen Elena since she was a child. The court remembers her only by reputation. And you, Clara, have the look, the dark hair, the pale skin. It was why I found you. You hunted me, she accused. I researched, he countered. There is a difference. The train rattled over a switch track, the rhythm thumping beneath their feet. Brian poured 2 glasses of brandy and slid one toward her. He took a long sip, his mask of composure slipping for just a fraction of a second to reveal a deep, exhausting fear. There is a condition, Brian said softly. Clara's hand paused halfway to the glass. I assumed the impersonation was the condition. No, that is the ruse. The condition is the price of the lie. Brian set his glass down. The amber liquid trembled. My Uncle Duke Silas suspects that Eleanor is dead. He suspects I am stalling. When we arrive, he will demand proof of our union. We are to be engaged, Clara said. That is proof enough, not for Silas, and not for the ancient laws of Avalonia. Brian looked her dead in the eyes. The king will demand a consummation ceremony on Christmas Eve. It is a medieval tradition. We must spend the night in the royal chapel locked in with the guards posted at the doors. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. I mean, we must make it look convincing, Brian said quickly. I will not touch you, Clara. I am not a savage. But we must be in that room alone for 12 hours. And he hesitated, a muscle twitching in his jaw. And what Clara demanded, and Brian whispered, You must sign a confession tonight. Clara stood up, the silk rustling loudly in the small cabin. A confession. Brian pulled a piece of parchment from his coat pocket. It was already written. This document states that you are a fraud, that you, Clara Thorne, bewitched the prince and tricked him into believing you were the Archduchess, that you acted alone. You want me to sign my own death warrant? Clara gasped, backing against the cabin door. If we are caught, you walk away the victim, and I go to the gallows. If we succeed, Brian said, rising to his full height, looming over her. I become king. I abolish the old laws. I pay you 10 times the amount promised, and I grant you a pardon and a title of your own. You will be safe forever. But if we fail, Silas will kill me. Anyway, Brian said, his voice raw with honesty, he will poison me or stage an accident. I am a dead man walking, Clara. This is my only play on the board. I need a shield. You are the shield. Clara stared at the paper. The ink was black and sharp. It was a betrayal waiting to happen. He was asking her to trust him with her life while simultaneously handing him the weapon to destroy her. She looked up at him. For the first time, she saw not a prince, but a man cornered by wolves. He was terrified. Why should I trust you? She asked. Brian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He tipped it over, and a heavy gold ring with a blood-red ruby tumbled onto the table. This was my mother's, he said. It is not the crown jewels. It is my private property. If I betray you, sell it. It is worth enough to bribe every judge in Europe. He placed the ring on top of the confession. Christmas is in 2 days, Clara. Be my wife. Save my life. Or pull the cord, stop the train, and walk back into the snow. Clara looked at the ring gleaming like a drop of blood. She thought of the cold wind on Blackfriars Bridge. She thought of the emptiness of her life before this moment. Danger was better than nothingness. She reached out, bypassed the ring, and picked up the pen. I don't want the ring, Clara said, her voice steady, as she signed her name in flowing script. Clara Elizabeth Thorne. She pushed the paper toward him. I want your word, Brian. If we survive this, you owe me a favor. Any favor I ask. No questions. Brian looked at the signature, then up at her, surprise softening his sharp features. A flicker of something dangerous admiration sparked in his eyes. Agreed, he said hoarsely. The train whistled a lonely, screaming sound in the dark night. They were crossing the border. There was no going back now. Then husband Clara said, smoothing her silk skirt. Tell me about the man we are going to deceive. Brian sat back, a grim smile touching his lips. Silas. He is not a man, Clara. He is a viper in a velvet coat, and the first thing you must know is that he was the one who made the real Elena disappear. Clara's breath hitched. She wasn't just replacing a missing woman. She was walking into the lair of her killer. The train arrived in the capital of Avalonia, under a sky the color of a bruised plum. Snow didn't fall here, so much as it haunted the air, swirling in thick, silent gusts that coated the world in a deceptive purity. Clara stepped onto the platform, her breath hitching in her throat. The station was draped in royal banners, crimson and gold, but the festive decorations felt like makeup on a corpse. Soldiers in grey greatcoats stood at rigid attention, their bayonets gleaming under the gas lamps. Brian offered her his arm. His grip was firm, almost bruising. "Remember," he murmured, his lips barely moving. "Chin up. You are Archduchess Elena. You belong here. Everyone else is a guest in your world." Clara nodded, forcing her spine to stiffen. She channeled the haughty indifference of the aristocratic women she had once served tea to. She pulled her fur collar tighter, not for warmth, but for armor. They were ushered into a carriage that looked more like a hearse than a royal transport. The interior was upholstered in crushed black velvet, as the horses pulled them through the winding cobblestone streets of the capital. Clara peered out the window. The people of Avalonia were not cheering. They watched the royal carriage pass with sullen, fearful eyes. "They are afraid," Clara whispered. "They are starving," Brian corrected, staring straight ahead. "My uncle has taxed the grain to pay for his personal guard. He claims it is for national security. The people know better." The ascent to Schloss Adler. The Eagle's castle was a treacherous, winding path up a jagged cliff face. The castle itself was a monstrosity of Gothic stone, bristling with spires that pierced the low-hanging clouds. It looked impenetrable. It looked inescapable. As the carriage clattered into the main courtyard, the massive iron gates groaned shut behind them. The sound echoed like a dungeon door. A line of servants stood shivering in the snow. At the center of the grand staircase stood a man. He was slight of build, unlike Brian's broad shoulders, and dressed in impeccable black silk. His hair was silver slicked back severely, and his face was a mask of polite concern. But it was his eyes that stopped Clara's heart, pale, watery, and unblinking. "Duke Orsilas," Brian breathed. "Show no fear, Clara. He can smell it like a hound." The footman opened the door. Brian stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand to Clara. She descended the cold wind, whipping her skirts. Silas glided down the stairs, his movement soundless. He stopped 3 steps above them, forcing them to look up at him. A power play. "Brian," Silas said, his voice smooth as oil. "We had begun to fear the worst. The telegrams were so sporadic. The storms in the pass were severe." "Uncle," Brian said, his voice clipped, "but I have returned, and I have brought her." Silas turned his gaze to Clara. It felt like a physical touch, slimy and invasive. He scrutinized her face, searching for a crack in the porcelain. He looked for the governess, the pauper, the fraud. Clara forced a smile, cold and imperious. "Duke Silas, it has been a lifetime." Silas descended the final steps and took her gloved hand. He didn't kiss it. He pressed his thumb against her knuckles hard. "Archduchess Elena, you have changed. The last time I saw you, you were weeping over a broken doll. And the last time I saw you, Duke," Clara said, improvising on a detail she had read in the dossier Brian provided, "you were arguing with my father about the price of timber. I see you still wear the same dour expression." Silas's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. "Time changes us all, my dear. You, for instance. Your accent. It has a touch of the British about it." Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. "I was educated in London for the last 3 years, as you well know. One adopts the cadence of one's surroundings." "Of course," Silas murmured, releasing her hand. "London. a city of fog and secrets. He stepped back, gesturing to the open doors where the warmth of the castle spilled out. "Come." The king is resting, but he is anxious. He has held on only for this, for the return of the prodigal son and his bride. They walked into the great hall. It was cavernous, the walls lined with the mounted heads of stag and boar. A massive fire roared in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill that seemed to radiate from the stone itself. "Dinner will be served in 2 hours," Silas announced. "I have prepared the east wing for you, Elena, and the west for you, Brian. Propriety must be observed until the wedding." "We are tired, Uncle," Brian cut in. "We will retire now." "One moment," Silas said, his voice sharpening. He snapped his fingers. A servant hurried forward with a silver tray holding 2 glasses of dark red wine. "A toast," Silas said, picking up a glass for himself. "To the happy couple. In Avalonia, it is bad luck to cross the threshold without a sip of the vintage." Brian stiffened. Clara saw his hand twitch toward his sword belt, a reflex. Poison. Was it this simple? Silas smiled, a thin, mirthless curving of his lips. "Come now, Brian. Surely you don't think I would harm the future queen in full view of the staff?" Clara stepped forward. She knew that if she hesitated, the game was over. She took the glass. The crystal was heavy. The liquid smelled of iron and berries. "To the king," Clara said clearly, raising the glass. She drank. The wine was bitter tart on her tongue. She swallowed, fighting the urge to gag. She looked at Silas defiantly. Silas watched her throat work. He waited. 1 second. 2. "To the king," Silas echoed, and took a sip of his own. Brian exhaled a sound only Clara heard, and drank his own. "Rest well," Silas said, placing his glass down. "We have much to discuss. The physician says the king's heart is failing. The wedding must take place immediately. Perhaps Christmas Eve." "That is in 2 days," Brian said. "Then you best not waste time sleeping," Silas whispered. He turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. As soon as they were out of earshot, climbing the grand staircase to the guest wings, Brian grabbed Clara's elbow. His face was pale. "You shouldn't have drunk that," he hissed. "If I hadn't, he would have known I was afraid," Clara whispered back. "Is it poison?" "No," Brian said grimly. "Silas is too subtle for arsenic in the hallway. He prefers psychological warfare. He wanted to see if you trusted me enough to drink it, or if you were suspicious. He knows something is wrong." I saw it in his eyes. They reached the landing. Brian stopped, looking at the heavy oak door that led to the east wing. "This is where I leave you for the night," he said. "My guards will be outside your door. Do not open it for anyone but me or the maid Greta. She is loyal. She was my nurse." Clara looked at the heavy door, then back at the prince. "Brian, he mentioned the wedding on Christmas Eve. That's the day of the condition. The consummation." Brian finished the word heavy between them. "Yes." "You said you wouldn't touch me," Clara said, searching his face. "I won't," Brian promised. "But we have to make the world believe I did. And Silas will be listening at the door." He looked at her, his blue eyes softening for the first time since London. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His fingers were warm, a stark contrast to the castle. "You were brave down there, Clara. Braver than the real Elena ever was." "The real Elena is dead, isn't she?" Clara asked softly. "Silas killed her." "I don't know." Brian admitted, his voice haunted. But if she is alive, she is praying we succeed. Lock your door, Clara. He turned and strode toward the west wing, leaving her alone in the dim corridor. Clara watched him go, feeling a strange, hollow ache in her chest. She wasn't sure what terrified her more, the man trying to kill them, or the man she was beginning to trust. The following morning, the castle was a hive of frantic activity. The announcement had been made. The royal wedding would take place on Christmas Eve, followed by the high mass on Christmas morning. Clara was woken not by sunlight. The sun seemed unable to penetrate the thick grey clouds surrounding the mountain, but by the rustling of silk. Greta the maid. Brian had promised was an older woman, with hands like gnarled roots and eyes that had seen too much. She moved efficiently, laying out a gown of heavy crimson velvet, trimmed with gold lace. "The king wishes to see you," Greta said, her voice rough. "He is awake. It is a rare thing." Clara sat up, shivering in the drafty room. "Does he know about Elena?" Greta paused, holding the corset. She looked at Clara, a sharp, assessing gaze. "The king knows what he wants to know. He wants his son settled. He wants the succession secure. Whether you are the Archduchess or a spirit from the heavens, he does not care, as long as you defeat the Duke." Greta tightened the corset with brutal efficiency. Clara gasped as the air was squeezed from her lungs. The dress that followed was magnificent, but heavy. It weighed 20 pounds, encrusted with jewels. When Clara looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize herself. Clara Thorne, the governess, was gone. A queen stared back, regal and terrified. "Do not speak unless spoken to," Greta advised, as she pinned a diamond tiara into Clara's dark hair. "And do not look at his hands. The disease has taken them." Clara met Brian in the gallery outside the king's chambers. Brian was dressed in his full military regalia, a sash of blue silk across his chest. He looked every inch the prince, but there were dark circles under his eyes. "Did you sleep?" Clara asked. "No," Brian said. "Silas was in the library all night, going through records. He's looking for something, a discrepancy." He offered his arm. "Ready?" "No," Clara said honestly. "Good. Complacency gets you killed." The king's chamber smelled of camphor-rotting flowers and sickness. The curtains were drawn, allowing only thin slivers of grey light to cut across the room. In the center lay a massive four-poster bed. King Leopold was a skeleton draped in ermine. His skin was translucent, stretching tight over his skull. His eyes were covered by milky cataracts, blind to the world, yet he turned his head sharply as they entered. "Father," Brian said, bowing low, "I have brought her." "Closer," the king rasped. His voice was like dry leaves skittering on stone. Clara stepped forward, her velvet skirts swishing softly. She knelt beside the bed. "Your Majesty," she whispered. A hand wrapped in bandages reached out. It trembled in the air. Clara hesitated, remembering Greta's warning, then gently took the king's wrist. "Eleanor," the king wheezed. "Little Eleanor." "I am here, sir." "You were quiet," the king murmured. "For so long. Silas said you ran away. With a stable boy." Clara felt a jolt of anger. So that was the lie Silas had spun. "Duke Silas was mistaken, Your Majesty. I was recovering in a convent in the Swiss Alps, seeking peace." The king laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Peace. There is no peace in this family. Only survival." He leaned forward, his blind eyes staring unseeingly into hers. "You smell of lavender. You used to smell of rose water." Clara froze. The dossier hadn't mentioned perfume. "People change, Your Majesty," Brian interjected smoothly from the foot of the bed. "Eleanor has grown up." "Quiet, boy," the king snapped. He gripped Clara's hand with surprising strength. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the stagnant air. Clara looked back at Brian. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Do you love my son?" the king demanded, his voice rising. "Or are you here for the crown? Tell me the truth. A dying man deserves the truth." Clara looked at the old man. She thought of Brian on the bridge, saving her life. She thought of the fear in his eyes on the train. She thought of the confession she had signed, binding her fate to his. It wasn't love, not the romantic love of poets, but it was something fierce. It was a partnership forged in the fires of desperation. "I am here for him," Clara said, her voice steady. "I would die to protect him." The king relaxed, sinking back into the pillows. It was the truth, and he heard it. "Good," he whispered. "Because Silas is hungry. Beware the dinner tonight, Eleanor. He has invited a guest, someone from your court in Romania." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. A guest from Romania. Someone who would know the real Elena by sight. "Who, father?" Brian asked sharply. "Who is coming?" "Countess von Dragon." The king mumbled, his energy fading rapidly. "Your old piano teacher." Brian's face went white. He grabbed Clara's shoulder. "We must go. Father needs rest." They backed out of the room, bowing. As soon as the heavy doors clicked shut, Brian dragged Clara into an alcove out of sight of the guards. "Von Dragos," he swore, "of all the people." "Who is she?" Clara asked, clutching his lapel. "She was Elena's governess for 10 years, Brian said, his eyes wild. "She raised her. She knows every mole, every scar, every inflection of her voice. If she sees you, the game is up. We will be arrested before the first course is served." "We have to leave," Clara said. "We have to run." "There is nowhere to run," Brian hissed. "The pass is snowed in. The trains are stopped for the holiday. And Silas has doubled the guard at the gates. Then what do we do?" Brian looked at her, his mind racing. "The Countess is old. She is nearly 80. Her eyesight is failing, much like my father's, but her hearing is sharp. So tonight at the welcome ball, you cannot speak to her," Brian commanded. "You cannot let her hear your voice close up. You must be distant, aloof. You are the Archduchess. You are above them." "Brian, if she raised Eleanor, she will know," Clara said, panic rising in her throat. "Then we have to ensure she doesn't get the chance to study you," Brian said darkly. "We have to create a distraction, a scandal so big that no one is looking at the nuances of your face." "What kind of scandal?" Brian looked at her, and for a moment the prince vanished, replaced by a desperate rogue. "Tonight," he said, "we are going to act like two people so madly in lust that we cannot keep our hands off each other. We will make them uncomfortable. We will make them look away. We will be so absorbed in our reunion that you won't have time to greet the Countess." Clara stared at him. "You want us to make a scene?" "I want us to survive," Brian said. He took her hand and raised it to his lips, kissing the inside of her wrist. The sensation sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. It was part of the act, she told herself. Just part of the act. Wear the red dress, Brian whispered against her skin. And tonight, Clara, act like you own me. The ballroom was a kaleidoscope of color and light. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over the hundreds of guests. The air was thick with the scent of pine wax and expensive perfume. But underneath the music of the string quartet, there was a current of tension. The courtiers whispered behind their fans, their eyes darting to the head of the room, where Duke Silas stood smiling like a shark. Beside him stood an elderly woman in black lace. She was leaning on a cane, her eyes scanning the crowd with hawk-like intensity. Countess von Dragos. "She's looking for you," Brian whispered in Clara's ear. He had his arm wrapped tight around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. It was improper. It was scandalous. It was perfect. "She looks terrifying," Clara murmured, keeping her head high. "Eyes on me," Brian commanded. He turned her so her back was to the Countess. "Don't look at her. Look at me." Clara looked up into his blue eyes. They were blazing with intensity. "Dance with me," he said. The orchestra began a waltz, Strauss, haunting and fast. Brian swept her onto the floor. He didn't dance like a prince on display. He danced with a possessive fervor. He spun her hard, her velvet skirts flaring out. Every time they neared the side of the room where the Countess stood, Brian spun her away, shielding her face with his shoulder, leaning in close to whisper in her ear, making her laugh, a forced, breathless laugh. The court watched scandalized. The prince was practically devouring his fiancée on the dance floor. "They are staring," Clara whispered, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "Let them stare," Brian said. "Better they stare at our indecency than your features." Suddenly the music stopped. Silas stepped into the center of the floor. "A pause, if you please," Silas announced, his voice booming. "We have a special guest who wishes to greet the bride, Countess von Dragos, who traveled all the way from Bucharest." The crowd parted. The elderly woman hobbled forward, her cane tapping rhythmically on the floor. Brian's grip on Clara's waist tightened until it hurt. "Stay calm," he breathed. The Countess stopped 3 feet away. She squinted, leaning forward. The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. "Elena," the Countess rasped. Her voice was cracked and dry. "Is that you, child?" Clara felt the weight of the confession in her mind. The gallows, the water of the Thames. She summoned every ounce of courage she possessed. She stepped away from Brian just an inch. She didn't curtsy. She didn't smile warmly. She looked at the woman with a haughty, imperious boredom. "Countess Ulm," Clara said, adopting a bored, slightly slurred drawl, as if she had had too much wine. "My goodness, you look exactly the same." The Countess frowned. She stepped closer. She reached out a hand to touch Clara's face. Brian stepped in between them. "The Archduchess is feeling faint, Countess. The journey was long." "I want to see her eyes," the Countess snapped, showing surprising strength as she tried to push past Brian. Elena had a speck of gold in her left iris, a birthmark from God. Clara's blood froze. She didn't have a gold speck. Her eyes were plain dark brown. The Countess was inches away. She raised her spectacles. "Look at me, child," she commanded. Clara had no choice. She lifted her chin. The Countess peered into her eyes. The silence stretched agonizing and long. Silas was smirking in the background, waiting for the denunciation, waiting for the guards to drag them away. The Countess stared. Then her eyes widened. Her mouth opened to speak. Clara braced herself for the scream of impostor. But before the Countess could make a sound, the heavy doors to the ballroom banged open. A soldier covered in snow and blood stumbled into the room. "Treason!" the soldier screamed, collapsing to the floor. "The mines! The rebels have bombed the silver mines!" The room erupted into chaos, screams, shouts. The distraction was absolute. Silas's smirk vanished. The silver mines were the source of his wealth. He turned barking orders at his guards. In the confusion, Brian grabbed Clara's hand. "Now move!" He dragged her not toward the exit, but toward the side door leading to the royal chapel. "The Countess saw—" Clara gasped as they ran down the stone corridor. "She saw my eyes, Brian. She knows. She knows." Brian agreed, kicking the chapel door open and slamming it shut behind them, sliding the heavy iron bolt into place. But she didn't get to say it. And now we have a bigger problem. "What problem?" Clara asked, backing away from the altar. Brian turned to her, his chest heaving. "Silas will want a scapegoat for the bombing. He will blame the foreigners. He will blame you. He won't wait for the wedding anymore." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Brian said, pacing frantically, "that we have to accelerate the timeline. We cannot wait for Christmas Eve. We have to do the consummation tonight." Clara looked at the cold stone floor of the chapel. The stained glass saints looked down on them, judging. "Here," she whispered. "Now. It's the only place legally considered sanctuary," Brian said. "Once we are locked in by law, no guard can enter until the sun rises. It buys us 12 hours. 12 hours to figure out how to silence the Countess and stop Silas." He looked at her, and the reality of the situation crashed down. They were locked in a cold chapel, hunted by a duke, exposed to a countess, and forced to act out a marriage rite to survive the night. "Take off the dress, Clara," Brian said softly, turning his back to her to give her privacy. "We have to make it look like we are occupied." Clara reached for the laces of her bodice, her hands trembling. Outside the door, heavy boots pounded against the wood. Silas's men. "Open up!" Silas's voice roared from the other side. "Open by order of the regent. We are consummating the union," Brian shouted back, his voice booming with authority. "Disturb us and you violate the sacred law of kings. Do you want to be excommunicated, uncle? Silence on the other side." Then a low, angry laugh. "Enjoy your night, nephew," Silas called out. "Because when the sun rises, the Countess will have quite the story to tell." Clara let the heavy velvet dress fall to the floor. She stood in her white chemise, shivering in the candlelight. Brian turned around. He didn't look at her body. He looked at her eyes. "We have until dawn," he whispered, "to save our lives." But as he looked at her, the air in the chapel shifted. It wasn't just fear anymore. In the candlelight, with the world trying to break down the door, Clara Thorne looked beautiful and dangerous. And for the first time, Brian wasn't thinking about the plan. He was thinking about her. The heavy iron bolt slid home with a finality that echoed off the vaulted stone ceiling. Inside the royal chapel, the air was still and freezing, carrying the scent of centuries of incense and cold wax. Clara stood in the center of the nave, her white chemise glowing like a ghost against the encroaching darkness. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently, not just from the temperature, but from the adrenaline crash. Brian leaned his forehead against the heavy oak door, listening. Outside, the muffled shouts of the guards and Silas's mocking laughter eventually faded, replaced by the heavy rhythmic thud of sentries pacing the corridor. He turned slowly. His face was a mask of exhaustion, the shadows from the votive candles carving hollows beneath his cheekbones. He looked at Clara, and for a moment he didn't see a hired actress. He saw a woman stripped of everything standing in the wreckage of his own making. "You're freezing," he said, his voice rough. He unbuttoned his military tunic, the heavy wool falling from his shoulders, and walked toward her. He draped it over her. It was heavy, smelling of tobacco, snow, and him. "There are blankets in the sacristy," Brian said quietly, "and wine. The priests always keep the good vintage for the Eucharist." They retreated to the small room behind the altar. It was slightly warmer here. Brian found a pile of rough wool blankets and created a makeshift pallet on the floor. He poured 2 chalices of wine, his hands steady despite the chaos. They sat on the floor, huddled under the blankets, the single candle flickering between them. The intimacy was forced yet undeniable. They were conspirators in a treasonous act, trapped in a holy place. "Tell me," Clara whispered, holding the chalice with both hands to warm her fingers. "Tell me the truth. Why did Silas kill her, the real Elena?" Brian stared into the flame. "Because Elena found out about the mines. The silver mines aren't just dangerous, Clara. They are tombs. Silas uses prison labor, political dissidents, debtors, anyone who opposes him. They work until they drop. Elena was young, but she wasn't stupid. She found the ledgers. She threatened to write to the Emperor of Austria." He took a long drink. "The next day she went riding. Her horse returned. She did not. Silas claimed she ran away with a lover to shame her memory and invalidate her claim to the throne." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "And you think he will do the same to us?" "I think he is already writing our eulogies," Brian said. He looked at her, his blue eyes intense. "Clara, you signed that confession, but I want you to know, if they break down that door before morning, I will burn it. I will tell them I kidnapped you. I will take the fall." Clara looked at him. The arrogance of the prince on the bridge had vanished. In its place was a man burdened by a crown he hadn't yet worn. "You would die for a governess?" she asked softly. "I would die for the only person who hasn't lied to me in 10 years, he replied. The silence stretched heavy and charged. The wind howled outside, battering the stained glass windows. "We have to make it look real," Brian said, suddenly his voice changing, becoming practical to hide the emotion. "The consummation. Silas will inspect the room. The priests will inspect the sheets." Clara blushed, the heat rising to her hairline. I don't know what to do." "We must dishevel the bedding," Brian said, moving to the pile of blankets. "And there must be blood." He pulled a small dagger from his boot. Before Clara could cry out, he drew the blade across his own palm. He didn't flinch. He pressed his hand against the white linen of the altar cloth he had pulled down, leaving a stark crimson stain. "There," he said, wrapping a handkerchief around his hand. "The ancient proof of purity. Barbarians, all of them." He sat back down beside her. The distance between them had shrunk. They were inches apart. Clara could feel the heat radiating from him. "Brian," she said, testing his name without the title. "What happens if we win? What happens if you become king?" "Then I am a prisoner in a different way," he said bitterly. "I will sign laws, I will attend balls, and I will marry a woman I do not know to secure a border." "You don't want to be king," she realized. "I wanted to be a botanist." He confessed, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "I wanted to study orchids in Brazil, But princes don't get to choose their gardens. We just get buried in them." He looked at her, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes. "And you, Clara, what did you want? Before the brooch? Before the bridge?" "I wanted to be seen," she whispered. "I was always the invisible girl, the governess in the corner, the daughter of the dead professor. I wanted a life that was mine." "You are seen now," Brian said softly. He reached out with his uninjured hand and cupped her face. His thumb traced her cheekbone. The air in the sacristy grew thin. The pretense of the fake marriage evaporated. "Clara," he breathed. He leaned in. It wasn't a ravishing kiss of a romance novel. It was slow, desperate, and terrified. His lips brushed hers, tentative at first, asking a question. Clara answered by closing the gap. She kissed him back, her hands tangling in his hair. For a moment, the cold stone walls vanished. There was only the fire of the wine, and the man who made her feel like a queen. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, a groan vibrating in his chest. It was a kiss of two people standing on the edge of a cliff, deciding to jump together. "We shouldn't," he whispered against her mouth, though he didn't pull away. "We are supposed to be consummating the marriage," Clara murmured, her heart hammering. "If I continue," Brian said, his voice low and dangerous, "I will not be pretending." He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in white clouds. He was shaking. "Sleep," he commanded gently, though his eyes burned. "Sleep, Clara. We need our strength. The wolves come at dawn." Clara lay her head on his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, protective and fierce. She listened to the steady beat of his heart, the only clock that mattered in the darkness. She fell asleep, pretending that this was real, that he was her husband, and she was his wife, and the morning would bring coffee, not an executioner. Dawn broke not with the warmth of the sun, but with the harsh grinding of iron hinges. The heavy doors of the royal chapel groaned open, spilling cold grey light onto the stone floor. Clara woke with a start, instinctively clutching Brian's tunic tighter around her shoulders. Brian was already on his feet, standing between her and the entrance, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Duke Silas stood in the doorway, flanked by the Bishop of Avalonia and two stone-faced guards. "Morning," Silas drawled, his pale eyes scanning the sanctuary. His gaze landed on the altar, where Brian had staged the scene. The disheveled blankets, the empty wine chalices, and the white linen cloth stained with the blood from his own hand. Silas walked over to the cloth, poking it with the tip of his cane. He turned to the bishop with a sneer. "Well, does it satisfy the holy law?" The bishop, trembling, nodded. "The evidence is irrefutable, Your Grace. The consummation is valid. They are husband and wife in the eyes of God and the state." Silas's jaw tightened. He looked at Clara, his eyes cold. "You have secured your position, niece. But do not get comfortable. The Countess von Dragos is waiting in the blue drawing room, and she is far less easily fooled than a senile bishop." The blue drawing room hung over the cliff edge, the wind rattling the glass. Countess von Dragos sat by the fire, looking like a vulture in black lace. When Clara and Brian entered, dressed in fresh clothes, the air in the room turned to ice. Silas moved to stand by the mantelpiece, eager to watch the Countess expose them. "Leave us," the Countess commanded, her voice like cracking parchment. She pointed a bony finger at Silas. "I wish to speak to the girl alone." "Countess, I really must insist," Silas began. "Get out!" she roared, slamming her cane on the floor. "Go count your tax money, Silas. Leave the family to me." Furious but outranked by protocol, Silas bowed stiffly and exited, leaving the heavy doors slightly ajar. The moment he was gone, the Countess turned her sharp gaze on Clara. "Come here, girl. Let me see your eyes." Clara stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She lifted her chin, bracing for the end. The Countess peered through her spectacles. Brown. Plain, muddy brown. Elena's eyes were topaz with a speck of gold in the left iris. Brian stepped forward. "Countess, please." "Quiet, Prince," she snapped. "I knew she was a fraud the moment she walked into the ballroom. You are not the Archduchess." "Then why didn't you expose us?" Clara whispered. "Why let us live?" The Countess leaned back, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "Because, my dear, I hated Elena." Clara and Brian froze. "She was a wretched child," the Countess spat. "Cruel, spoiled, and exactly like her uncle. If she had become queen, she would have destroyed this country. But you—" She looked at Clara with a strange respect. "I saw you dance. I saw you fight for him. You have the heart of a queen, even if you lack the blood." She reached into her bodice and pulled out a crumpled map. "Silas thinks you are a ghost sent to haunt him. He knows Elena is dead because he ordered her death." "He killed her?" Brian asked, his voice shaking with rage. "He tried to hide the body," the Countess whispered, pushing the map across the table. "This is the layout of the old wine cellars. There is a false wall behind the vintage racks. That is where his men dumped her remains. If you find her signet ring, you prove he is a regicide. You are giving us the weapon to destroy him," Clara realized, taking the map. "I am an old woman," the Countess said, her eyes watering. "I want to see him hang before I die. Go, now." But before they could move, the doors banged open. Silas strode back in triumph, blazing on his face, waving a telegram. "A touching reunion," he sneered. "But I'm afraid the police have just arrested the mine foreman. Under persuasion," he confessed. Silas pointed a finger at Brian. "He says you paid him to bomb the silver mines to frame the rebels." "That is a lie," Brian shouted. "It is treason," Silas declared. "Guards arrest the prince, and his wife the accomplice." Soldiers swarmed the room. As rough hands grabbed Clara's arms, she looked at Brian in panic. "The tower!" she gasped. Brian looked at the map clutched in her hand, then at the open door leading to the servants' corridor. "No," Brian whispered, his eyes dark with determination. "The crypts." The guards shoved them toward the spiraling stone stairs of the West Tower, but they had underestimated the desperation of a prince fighting for his life. As they passed the heavy oak door leading to the kitchens, Brian drove his elbow backward into the guard's solar plexus, snatching the man's saber before he hit the ground. "Run, Clara!" Brian roared, parrying a bayonet thrust from the second guard. "To the cellar!" Clara didn't hesitate. She hiked up her skirts and sprinted down the servants' passage, the cold air burning her lungs. Brian followed seconds later, bolting the heavy iron door behind them. They descended into the black abyss of the wine cellar. Using the Countess's map and a stolen lantern, they navigated the labyrinth of dusty barrels until they found the false wall behind the oldest vintage racks. It crumbled under Brian's shoulder, revealing the damp, freezing air of the ancient crypts. "Here," Clara gasped, pointing to a small, unconsecrated alcove marked on the paper. "She said he hid her where the light doesn't touch." Brian fell to his knees, tearing away loose stones. There, wrapped in a rotting velvet cloak, lay the skeletal remains of a small woman. Glinting on the finger bone was a ring the unmistakable heavy gold signet of the House of Valois. He didn't even bury her, Brian whispered, his voice cracking with rage. He just discarded her like rubbish. And now you join her. The voice echoed off the stone walls. Silas stood at the entrance of the crypt, a pistol leveled at Clara's heart. He was alone, his eyes manic. I expected you to run, Silas sneered, stepping over the rubble. But coming here to dig up old bones, it changes nothing. I will kill you both, burn this crypt and tell the world you died in a suicide pact. You admitted it, Clara said, stepping in front of Brian. You killed her because she was stronger than you. I killed her because she was weak, Silas screamed, his composure shattering. She wanted to give the people rights. She would have ruined us. I did what was necessary for the crown. And that, a frail voice rasped from the shadows, is treason. Silas froze. From the darkness behind him, King Leopold emerged, supported by the Countess and the captain of the guard. The king looked like a corpse walking, but his eyes were clear, burning with a father's final fury. Father, Brian breathed. I heard you, brother, the king wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at Silas. I heard it all. Silas raised the pistol, panic wild in his eyes. I did it for you, Leo, to save your legacy. You destroyed my legacy, the king spat. Arrest him! Silas turned to fire, but Brian was faster. He threw his sword not to kill but to disarm. The blade struck Silas's wrist. The gun clattered to the stone floor. The guards swarmed him, dragging the screaming duke away into the darkness. The king looked at Brian, then at the skeleton in the alcove. He wept a silent, terrible shaking of his shoulders. Then he looked at Clara. You are not her, the king whispered. But you have her spirit, and you saved my son. Christmas morning broke with a blinding, brilliant sun reflecting off the snow. The castle bells rang out not for a wedding, but for a coronation. King Leopold had passed in his sleep just hours after the arrest at peace, knowing the truth. In the private solar, Brian stood by the fireplace. He held the confession Clara had signed on the train. The deal is done, Brian said softly. He threw the paper into the fire. You are free, Clara. The carriage is waiting to take you to Paris. You have your money. Clara watched the paper turn to ash. She looked at the money on the table enough to live like a queen for the rest of her life. Then she looked at the man who stood alone, the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. You promised me a favor, Clara said, walking toward him. Any favor, no questions. Brian looked at her, his heart in his eyes. Name it. Clara picked up the heavy ruby ring he had offered her on the train, his mother's ring, and pressed it into his hand. Ask me to stay, she whispered. Not as a pretender, not as an archduchess, but as your wife. Brian didn't hesitate. He dropped the ring, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her a kiss that tasted of freedom of winter and of a love that had survived the dark. Stay, he breathed against her lips. Stay forever. And outside, for the first time in 20 years, the people of Avalonia cheered. And so the governess, who stood on the edge of the Thames, became the Queen of the Alps. Clara Thorne and King Brian didn't just survive the winter. They dismantled a tyranny and built a reign founded on the most dangerous weapon of all, the truth. Their story reminds us that sometimes we have to lose everything to find the one thing worth fighting for. In a world of masks and deception, it was an impostor who taught a prince how to be a true king. Thank you for listening to this tale of romance, danger, and betrayal. If Clara and Brian's story captured your heart, please like this video. It helps us bring more stories to life. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Would you have run with the money or stayed for the prince? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a chapter of our next historical drama. Until next time.